Okay, welcome everyone to our virtual roundtable. We're excited today to have Amy Godine here today. Amy is author of The Black Woods, Pursuing Racial Justice on the Adirondack Frontier, which explores the influence and will today explore the influence of Vermont's anti-slavery culture on mid-19th century
Oh,
abolitionist-founded farm initiative in New York. And so Amy is from Saratoga Springs, New York. And she's been writing and speaking about ethnic, migratory, and Black Adirondack history for more than 3 decades. Exhibits she has curated include Dreaming of Timbuktu at the John Brown Farm State Historic Sites in North Elba, New York. So excited to have Amy here today, and I'm going to turn it right on over to you. Amy, thank you.
thank you. Thank everybody for coming and listening to this. I'll be very excited for the um, question and answer period at the end, the discussion. But before then, I'll read for about a half hour on my thoughts about this subject, and I'll try to pretend I'm looking at you the whole time that I'm reading, but hopefully you'll be fooled. Just a minute. I'm delighted that you're interested in this because it shows you recognize the relevance of so-called New York history for so-called Vermont history. I'm going to show, I hope, the intersectionality of both with examples in my talk, and I'll look forward to your response. The talk is called A Two-Way Resonance, and I'm going to start with some information about John Brown because he's so important to the story, but he's not really the subject. He's just a way to get started. We'll start on October 16th, 1859, when this poor Adirondack wool broker and sheep farmer from the Adirondack Mountains launched an attack on a government arsenal and armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Brown's expectation was that the arsenal would furnish his 22 guerrilla fighters with enough guns and ammo to help enslaved people secure their own and their Black neighbors' liberation. And as the uprising took hold, Brown reasoned its momentum and success would so panic and distress white enslavers, they would recognize that the defense of slavery was not worth the risk and trouble. This was his big plan. We know how this worked out. In 3 days, the raid was crushed. 5 raiders got away, but 10 were killed, and 7 more were captured, and they eventually were killed too. What did succeed, as Brown guessed it might, and why we remember this ill-starred raid at all, was how it galvanized and polarized public opinion in an already riven nation. Not just the brazen raid, but Brown's trial and conviction, his eloquent remarks to the court, family, and reporters, and his confident serenity in the face of his own hanging, all this assured the world's rapt gaze would fix on the bitter conflict between pro-slavery America and its northern foe, and nothing would go back to how it was. Brown would be, as Whitman put it famously, the meteor of the war, and his effort, the long flash that illuminated the divide that widened into the bloody Civil War and ended slavery forever. But Brown did not work in isolation. His influences were many. The appeals of radical Black abolitionists David Walker from Boston and New York's Henry Highland Garnett both inspired his militancy. And there was the state next to his own, too, Vermont, which since 1877 had been modeling for the nation an unslaved legal refuge where Black Vermonters enjoyed the rights of suffrage, and slave hunters and slave marketers and dealers were not welcome. And yes, I am aware of recent scholarship documenting instances of enslavement in Vermont. The reality was imperfect. Um, but today I'm talking about image and Vermont's longstanding reputation as an anti-slavery beacon. In the antebellum South, that beacon stood for Yankee arrogance and a contempt for federal law, and to anti-slavery reformers in the North, and especially New York, It stood for a higher law, a greater possibility. And New York's John Brown was, like every abolitionist, made hopeful by it, just as Vermonters would in time be made hopeful by Brown's work in Kansas and at Harper's Ferry, even declaring a state John Brown Day in 2017. No one of the states where Brown actually lived, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, Kansas, Massachusetts, or Maryland, or Ohio, did this. Just Vermont. And how, in turn, did New York influence Vermont? It was always a two-way exchange. The influence New York had on Vermont in this era, and Vermont on New York, lights up so many windows. Regional and national anti-slavery conventions in Troy, Utica, Albany, and Montpelier brought together reformers from a range of states for days of speeches, argument, and resolutions, encounters which invariably expanded every activist's understanding of his territory. New York anti-slavery activists like Samuel May, Frederick Douglass, and Theodore Weld were powerfully moved by their visits with the charismatic Vermont abolitionist Roland Robinson at Rokeby, as Jane Williamson has shown in her scholarship. Underground Railroad operatives on the border of New York and Vermont led or directed freedom seekers from Vermont to New York over a score of routes. And of course, fugitives often traveled the other way as well, from Vermont to New York. And all this Tom Calarco has documented in his great essay on these movements. The Battenkill River delivered self-emancipating slaves from eastern New York to anti-slavery households in Paulet and Rupert. Fugitives in New York's Whitehall and Hoosick tramped back roads to safe houses in Bennington, and escaping slaves in Albany looked for canal boats that might deliver them to the safer shoreline of Vermont. Another window, the restless itineraries of anti-slavery preachers who moved back and forth across the borders of New England and New York, marking their territory not in terms of state divides, but the receptivity of this community or the vicious dogs in that one. My window on these Vermont-New York connections only lifted for me when I was researching my book, The Black Woods: Pursuing Racial Justice on the Adirondack Frontier. And it didn't open early. What had Vermont to do with the saga of a rich, white New York's abolitionists' effort to populate the Adirondack wilderness with impoverished Black New Yorkers in 1846? That abolitionist, Gerrit Smith, had inherited much of his near million acres from his father and bought more on his own, and his ties with New York's Black reform community were deep. With his activist allies, he shared a revulsion for a New York suffrage ruling, a state ruling since 1821, that made the ownership of $250 in real property obligatory for any Black New Yorker who hoped to vote. White men faced no such restriction, again from 1821. Delegates to New York State Constitutional Convention had a chance to kill this racialized requirement in 1846. But instead, they chose to let the voters decide, and in November, predictably, white voters in New York reinstated the onerous restriction by a wide majority. Hence, Gerrit Smith's decision to donate 120,000 acres of his undeveloped Adirondack land to 3,000 impoverished Black New Yorkers in mostly 40-acre plots. On August 1, 1846, in a long letter to 3 Black reformers in metropolitan New York, Smith unveiled his so-called, quote, scheme of justice and benevolence. He tapped these reformers and 9 others, white and Black, to canvass every county in the state for worthy recipients for land. His requirements: poverty and landlessness, for one thing, good character as well, and they had to be living in New York State, and temperate, and of an age to work a farm. But Smith could not do this thing alone. He asked these activists to help him get the word out about this opportunity and pick his deed holders with care from every county, and all of them agreed to do this. No pay, no compensation, just the delight of helping with an opportunity to make landless, poor Black people landed and give them an opportunity to build their land to the value of a vote, the right to vote. At their pulpits, in their newspapers, their anti-slavery and temperance conventions, at special neighborhood and county meetings in Ithaca, Syracuse, Troy, and Albany, Brooklyn, Westchester, and Manhattan, they got the word out and enlisted subagents, also volunteers, to pitch Smith's plan in New York City slums and hamlets. By the early 1850s, all 3,000 deeds had takers. Smith's agents had come through. But what had this, a bid for suffrage justice for Black New Yorkers, to do with Vermont? In Smith's first letter about his bold initiative, the one he wrote his friends in New York City, he declared, first sentence, "I am an agrarian. I would that every man who desires a farm might have one." Yes, Smith was very much desired to help Black New Yorkers get access to the franchise, but just as fervently, he wanted to enable a Black exodus from New York's mob-ridden, disease-hobbled, color-phobic cities where most Black New Yorkers lived, and get them to their own farmsteads in regions of the state with no history of slaveholding or obdurately racialized traditions. Smith's properties in western Essex and southern Franklin counties in New York fit this bill. This part of northern New York was famously well populated with New Hampshire and Vermont pioneers and their descendants. Hamlets took their names from New England and Vermont in particular, and their civic culture too. What better haven than this region for Smith's refugees from city racism? Did any of Smith's gift lots hold a $250 value in 1846? $50 was more like it, but Smith was confident that steady work and gradual improvement of the land would give his grantees property the $250 value they would need to cast a ballot, not right away, but maybe over a few years. As he put it bluntly in his explanation of the giveaway, quote, "Since the state has determined that Black men must become landholders, that they may be entitled to vote, they will become landholders. Vote they will, cost what it will." Years later, when Smith wrote Horace Greeley about the resounding failure of his plan to take hold and flourish, maybe 200 Black settlers, tops, including women and children, ever moved to his Adirondack gift land in the quarter century that followed his announcement. In that letter, Smith would racialize the failure of his giveaway as proof of Black incapacity, lack of initiative, lack of the right pioneering stuff. Never recognized, never admitted Smith's grievous ignorance of the depth of Black urban impoverishment. Never noted his mistake in not extending his new pioneers' startup capital to launch this effort. Smith expected that a paper deed could somehow, of itself, conjure up the funds for travel, tools, axes, rifles, livestock, wagons or their rental, a backwoods guide, and a survey. He assumed a deed would cancel their concerns about white racism in a rurality where Black faces were virtually unknown, and correct their unfamiliarity with northern subsistence farming. And when his gift deeds failed to work this magic, he blamed his beneficiaries. In the letter Greeley published in the Tribune in 1857, Smith offered, quote, "White men who live in the Adirondacks support their families only by very hard work and very frugal habits. Why, then, considering the character of the colored people, should we expect them to do much in such a country?" In my book, I document a brighter side to this story to which Smith himself remained indifferent, and that is how, and I talk about how things worked out for those Black pioneering families who did take hold in the wilderness and who in some cases called their farms and hamlets home for generations. But you wouldn't know it to read 150 years of local, county, and regional history where the Black Adirondack experience is effectively erased. For that granular, long-valued story, salvaged mainly from a slew of archival sources, you'd better read my book. Today's emphasis is different. Did Garrett Smith's initiative register with Vermonters? did they claim an Adirondack settlement plan for Black New Yorkers as their business, their concern. The great upstate philanthropist Gerrit Smith was well known in Vermont. From 1830 to 1846, his name cropped up in Vermont newspapers 220 times. The American Anti-Slavery Society, which he helped found, would inspire the organization of 90 anti-slavery societies in Vermont alone. And I think ultimately more than that. That's just a count from the 1830s. So it stands to reason that when Smith unveiled his land giveaway, newspapers in Wilmington, St. Albans, Middlebury, and Brattleboro, Vermont took note. William Slade, a former Vermont governor and congressman, wrote Smith at once, "I am very much gratified by the exhibitions of your generous liberality to our colored brethren, and that not only on account of the good done to them, for its effort in rendering pointless and powerless the shafts of your traducers." Papers in St. Albans and Montpelier reported on a meeting in Troy, New York, where Smith grantees applauded Smith's idea and shared their high hopes for a new life on self-owned acreage in the woods. Some grantees would launch a colony outside the Adirondacks in Florence, New York, and this effort Vermont papers picked up on too. But Vermont's faithful interest in Gerrit Smith's philanthropy, which was more about praising Gerrit Smith than how these settlements were doing, who was coming, and why they might not be working, their interest in that effort was no match for Vermont's avid appetite for news of his good friend, the one-time Adirondack farmer John Brown, who in 1855 removed to the Kansas Territory to lead guerrilla strikes against slavery's defenders with a hand-picked band of abolitionists. What accounts for Vermont's exceptional devotion to Brown's memory and cause? Not only did Brown not come from Vermont or live here, he ventured to it only rarely, once in a while catching a boat from Westport across the lake to Vergennes on a return trip to the Adirondacks, and once to go to Cavendish to seek permission to use guns from a Vermont armory for free soil pioneers who needed them. The appeal was denied. Not until John Brown betook himself to Kansas in 1855 and Eastern reporters, correspondents began to describe his bold forays in their papers, did Vermont newspapers pick up on this and embrace his work. In Vergennes, Vermonters read about the ankle chain that a pro-slavery detachment of dragoons made Brown's son Jason wear on a 30-mile hike. The chains would be displayed at Republican headquarters in Boston, quote, "a memento of modern barbarism." In St. Albans, Vermonters learned of their own countryman, Enos Berg's Theron Powers, who fell at Osawatomie, one of Brown's Kansas martyrs, and was, the story went, buried in the same grave as Frederick, Brown's murdered son. Vermonters in St. Johnsbury shuddered for Reverend Webster of Montpelier, who was beaten by pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, quote, "for no other reason than he was from the free state of Vermont." Brown, Gerrit Smith, reported in the Orleans Independent Standard, was doing, quote, "more than any other to beat back the tide of border ruffianism and slavery," quote. And what a welcome change after, quote, "all the gaseous oratory in or out of Kansas." Readers of the Vermont Journal in Windsor gasped at the high price Missouri legislators had put on John Brown's head. Bleeding Kansas packed the headlines here, and over and again the cause of free soil and freedom was annealed to Brown's name. Uncomplaining, unrelenting, pious, and single-purposed, Brown put a plain, familiar Yankee face on the distant conflict, made it local, brought it home. Brown resonated with Vermonters for other reasons, too. His faith in good, thrifty, self-providing husbandry, his agrarian ethic, that is, as God's best work, his aversion to big cities, his impatience with extravagance, frivolity, and vanity, his devotion to the founding fathers and his own vaunted Puritan heritage, and most of all, His brand of piety expressed less in ritual than in daily acts and homely small routines. All this spoke to Vermont's own narrative, its public image. But the overriding affinity, obviously, was the New York abolitionist and the anti-slavery state's shared recognition of the wrongness of enslavement, a recognition that could not be compromised even when its defense might mean you had to break the law to keep a higher law that revered the Golden Rule. In 1850, when Congress enacted the Fugitive Slave Law, Vermont responded with its own habeas corpus law, which directed Vermont law enforcers and judicial officials to help out captured fugitives. This stark show of contempt for a federal ruling so angered Southern governors, they challenged Vermont's right to statehood, called for a boycott, excuse me, a boycott of Vermont-made goods, and raised the specter of secession. Brown also set up a court procedure for people accused of being fugitive slaves that effectively made the Fugitive Slave Act unenforceable, and so riled President Fillmore, he threatened to send the U.S. Army to Vermont if that's what it took to keep the law. This never happened. But Southern memory was long, and when Vermont legislators approved a gift of $20,000 in aid for free soil immigrants to Kansas, and one of these immigrant parties called itself the, quote, Vermont colony, and with insufferable Yankee efficiency got itself constitutionalized before it even left the region, Georgia's legislature was moved to vivid protest, resolved that His Excellency President Pierce be requested to employ a sufficient number of able-bodied Irishmen to proceed to the state of Vermont and to dig a ditch around the limits of the same and to float the thing into the Atlantic. How easy and natural, then, for John Brown and Vermont to sometimes find themselves conflated, for Vermont to claim this non-Vermonter for its own. In 1857, the minister reporter Thomas Wentworth Higginson offered an account of Kansas. Quote, if I wanted a genuine warrior of the American Revolution, he offered, where could I better find him than the old Vermonter, Captain John Brown, the defender of Osawatomie, the defender of a little log hut with 27 men against 200 killed or wounded, with only the loss of one man of his own. Old John Brown, the Ethan Allen, the Israel Putnam of today, who has prayers every morning and then sallies forth with 7 stalwart sons, wherever duty or danger calls, who swallows a Missourian whole and says grace after the meal. A month before he went to Kansas, Higginson had a private meeting with Brown in Boston. He knew where Brown was from. He said Brown was a Vermonter, not because he was confused, it just made sense to him. If Brown wasn't a Vermonter, he should have been. Vermontness, from his vantage, was less about a residency than an attitude, a starting point, a clarity of view. Did New York really deserve him? Vermont would stake its claim on Brown's martyred memory again at his funeral in North Elba, when Brown's widow Mary and Wendell Phillips tapped Joshua Young, a minister from Burlington, Vermont, to preside over the burial. Young came a long way in hard weather for this honor and faced some ugly snubbing from his congregants on his return to Burlington. 3 years later, he found another parish in Hingham, Massachusetts. Quote, leaving, a newsman put it in 1904, the Burlington people to work out their own repentance in light of subsequent history. A few years after Brown's funeral, when Salmon Brown, John Brown's son, went to Plattsburgh to volunteer for service, a cohort of officers, New York officers, turned him away. They felt his participation would put his company at risk. Not Vermont. Send him to us, wrote a Vermonter to the Liberator. Here in Vermont, not a regiment has been organized and sent to the war, but would have welcomed to their ranks with honest pride and respect the son of John Brown. As to what Vermont signified to Black New Yorkers who were engaged in anti-slavery, here too the local papers have much to teach us. All of Smith's Black land agents, educated and in some cases quite erudite reformers, knew Vermont's reputation. the first and only state to outlaw slavery, defy the Fugitive Slave Act, criminalize the pursuit of fugitives. How could they not? As early as 1837, Black city activists, city, I mean New York City, were reading about Vermont's, quote, purity of character and, quote, spirit of liberty that breathes through its political institutions in Manhattan's black paper of note, The Colored American. Elder Charles Bennett Ray, one of Smith's city land agents, wrote and edited The Colored American in the 1830s and may have written this himself. These city activists were not the first Black churchmen to work the anti-slavery circuit in rural Vermont and New York's northern counties, as I mentioned before. On either side of the state line, Congregationalist Lemuel Holmes made his home. He ministered to a Rutland congregation for 30 years and in South Granville in New York for another 10. At mid-century, Vermont's anti-slavery contingent tapped Black abolitionists from Albany, Syracuse, Cortland, Troy, and New York City to make the small-town Vermont rounds. And I have to wonder if these activists, many of them, really all of them, Gerrit Smith's grantees and agents, land agents, saw the tidy farms and hopeful orchards of Vermont as a model for Smith's New York grantees in the Adirondacks. Troy's Henry Highland Garnett was especially besotted. Among these mountains, the great minister wrote of Vermont, you find a people extraordinary for their humanity, their love of liberty, and for their intelligence. As to what Vermont signified to Black New Yorkers who were engaged in anti-slavery activity, here too, the local papers have much to teach us. Actually, hold on there. I wrote that paragraph, so let me cut it out and go on to the one, where I really should start up. It's going to save us some time. Okay, as for the grantees themselves, I'm sorry about that. We don't know if they shared the view of the land agents, the erudition and romantic view of Vermont that these land agents may have held, but their actions probably spoke louder than Garnett's words. After the Civil War, Private Josiah Hasbrook, a grantee's son, moved his young family from the Adirondacks to tiny Middlesex, a hill town northwest of Montpelier. Why Middlesex is a mystery that the town historian Patty Wiley and I would love to solve, but so far all we can guess is they had friends from the war there or compelling links to in-laws in Montpelier. In Private Hasbrook's case, not only did he stick with farming all his able-bodied life, his migration to Vermont emboldened other Black Adirondackers to join him. To a small farm near his own would come his half-sister Lucy and her husband, Private Jerry Miles, once enslaved, who had moved from the South to the Adirondacks after the war. The Adirondack grantee farmer Leonard Warts moved to Middlesex as well. Elderly grantees from the Adirondacks came to visit, often for long spells. The Hasbrooks themselves gained such a reputation for their hospitality in this town, a Montpelier paper dispatched a reporter to cover two of this family's massively attended integrated anniversary parties with fiddling, card games, hymns and prayers, fistfights, dancing, and an eye-popping display of gifts. The tireless Hasbrooks not only integrated sleepy Middlesex, they put it on the social map. So, a New York story or Vermont's? Obviously neither. The Hasbrooks' bold trajectory straddled both. All the stories I've described were border jumpers, uncontainable by state or county lines, urging a more subversive, flexible cartography, a social landscape big enough to accommodate the reach of Smith's initiative, the diasporic moves of Black America, of his grantees, the long reach of kinship ties, and the restless roots of anti-slavery activists and preachers. They say, get past the map. There is another map, uncharted, that shows the influence of need or boredom, the draw of opportunity, the tug of family, the comfort of political affinity, the passion for another start. And this counts too. It's the map we can depend on to reveal just how dynamic, fluid, and absorbent our cross-state stories really are. I think that's enough out of me. I'm right on the mark. So I'm gonna get this off, put you back on. And can you all see me or hear me?
Yep, we
Oh,
can,
good.
Amy. Thank you so much.
Great.
Uh, Wonderful things to think about and talk about. So now we have time for questions. So again, you can feel free to use the Q&A function, or you can put it in the chat, and we will hope to have some uh, good discussion on some of these really great aspects that Amy has brought forward. And again, if you do would like to speak at any time, we can also use the raise hand function, and that will help us to identify if you would prefer to talk. So I don't doesn't look like I have any questions right off, but um, I'll start with sort of a little bit, Amy, as far as I really love hearing kind of the Middlesex information, and also that kind of sort of switch between talking about how local and regional history does or does not reflect these movements or this Black history. And I guess, did you see any differences in the way that approach looked in different areas of either New York or Vermont? Or is it just sort of happenstance that a place like Middlesex was able to kind of have this information and this family?
Oh, Middlesex just got lucky to have a local historian who got on this and did some hard digging and helped me out with this story immensely. Um, what I often find missing in local histories is that wider reach that gets historians outside their own turf, which is so rich. I can see why people are captivated. But unless you track where people come from when they enter your town and where they go when they leave, you only have, I think, a part of the story. And part of my purpose is to um, really push for a more migratory vision of how people lived, something that accommodates how fluid people's lives were and how responsive to opportunity, and where they came from and where they went is part of their story too. It is therefore part of the local story because it informs it. It explains their arrival, it explains their departure, and it's more coherent and inclusive. So that's always very exciting to me too. And that's what interested me in the movements of the grantees who came to the Smith lands. Why did they come from? Where did they come from? Why did they leave those places? And where did they go when they left? And I found stories that really put me at odds with assumptions that they all drifted back to cities because that's where they belong. In fact, a lot of them, like the Hasbrooks and the Miles, continued to farm and so forth. So I say reach wider. That's my
And yeah, and just a note, Patty Wiley is on here.
oh
Hi, Patty.
good.
And she says, I got lucky by interviewing and knowing some elders in Middlesex in the 1980s and 1990s who still remembered some of the Hasbrook and Miles families and provided me with stories and photos.
Yeah, that was a real stroke of luck. We used some of those photos in an exhibit in Middlebury and um, hope to use them again in the exhibit in the at the John Brown Farm if we can expand that someday.
All right. And it looks like Lila's got her hand raised. So, Lila, I'm going to press the button for you to talk and just make sure that you unmute yourself. There we go.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I can
Yeah,
hear you.
this is this is not really a question, but I just wanted to encourage anybody who's interested in this whole story to go to the John Brown homestead, which is right outside of Lake Placid, right in view of the ski jump or ski facilities there. And my husband and I went 2 years ago, and it was it's a fascinating place. It's a fascinating story, and there's the very good exhibit, at least there was at that time, about the Timbuktu experiment that I gather uh, Amy was the person who put that together. But I just, I think it's really worth going and actually seeing the place and thinking about what was there and why.
Yeah, thank you, Lila. I agree. The exhibit was the spur that there was so much material that turned up for that exhibit I couldn't put on the walls. I thought, well, I'll write a short book, which it's not what
Not,
it turned
not
out
as
to
short as
be. But it's just such a rich story. And at the time I did the exhibit, I really wasn't as aware of how wide the reach of these settlements were. I hadn't done my homework on the little settlements in Franklin County to the north, on the several grantees who got land but didn't move to this particular pocket of the Adirondacks, but elsewhere. And it just got wider and wider. And then there was this remarkable discovery of, with the help of Patty, of the sort of Timbuktu East in Vermont, where a chain migration brought several families to this little town, and they had, from all accounts, a pretty resilient, productive, and encouraging sojourn there. The Hasbrooks eventually moved when Josiah became unable to do farm work, and they moved down to Amherst. And everybody gets a job in Amherst, and he collects trash. I think he works for the post office too, and they have a good stretch in Amherst before the family eventually dies out. And the Miles, a family that Patty did a lot of homework on, stayed in the town until the 30s. That's a long reach, many generations deep. So it's a story with legs as well as depth. It travels. And that's what you miss if you just stick with the Hasbrooks when they were on their Adirondack land. You miss where they came from, you miss where they went. That's part of the Black diasporic story that we often miss.
Well, we were very interested to see some references to Middlesex when we were at the John Brown Farms, and very brief ones because we live in Worcester, which is
Right.
the next town over. And, it really is a fascinating story. I had no idea that that had happened in Middlesex until
Yeah.
going to New York.
And also, people from Vermont came to the Adirondacks to marry the children of the grantees and veterans moved over. Sons of Black families moved over and married the daughters of Black grantees in Saranac Lake. So there's a sort of interplay between Vermont and New York represented in the demographic shifts in that community. That was kind of fun to track as well.
Great.
Yeah.
And Lila, Patty also notes that Hasbrook was heavily involved with the GAR in Worcester. So
Oh,
that's
thank
another
you,
connection.
Patty. Yeah. Not only involved, he becomes the commander of the post,
Mm.
which is really something I think I can't imagine that would have happened in the Adirondacks. I just don't see um, that possibility. There were some Black veterans who joined overwhelmingly white GAR posts and are feted in obituaries and by GAR members on their death. But an appointment as commander is a respect of a different order, and that really made Middlesex stand out to me. Or maybe it's Worcester. Patty knows where the post was. Close enough. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. All right. Okay. And I did put a link to Amy's book in the chat.
Oh,
So
cool.
definitely if you haven't read it, please do so. And is the exhibit at the John Brown, the Timbuktu exhibit still there
It's a
or
it's a permanent exhibit. So it's very much still there. My hope is that we'll be able to add some of the findings from the book and the research for the book in the exhibit as we expand it, that it will grow to include more information and especially stories from outside the Adirondacks that trace the movements of the grantees as they move to Vermont or to Iowa or the Dakota Territory in one case. They keep moving, even if the story at the John Brown farm does not. The grantees take their agrarian ideas elsewhere. And I do feel that Vermont, this is very hard to document aside from Henry Highland Garnett's fulsome quotes about Vermont. It's hard to find the proof of the love affair between the Black activists with Vermont when they went to these small towns on their lecture tours and were greeted with fulsome press reviews and announcements of their coming and encouragement to go to these talks. They weren't invited to talk in Adirondack towns. That did not happen. The Adirondack social culture was a generation behind Vermont's, or more than that, so that might explain it. But Vermont was an exceptional place for them to see how a farming community could be equalitarian, accepting, not race blind, but certainly more tolerant and interested than the cities they all came from. So I think Vermont made its mark on their high hopes for for Garrett Smith's idea. It just makes sense to me.
All right, time for a couple more questions. If you got them. I'm just going to ask my general question that I always love to ask researchers, and I think you've gone through a few of these things, but kind of what surprised you the most about kind of the materials that you've been researching, or the areas that you've gotten into? Um,
Oh, that's a good question. I guess what surprised me the most was how much solid information was available in archival sources that that challenged the antiquarian reports and county histories and town histories that had been passed down by generations and taken up as gospel and never challenged, really until this century. Though I think a town historian went far to dig into the stories of the Black grantees in her town. She didn't go to documentary sources that would reveal the political base of the story in a quest for voting rights. That was news that doesn't appear in any antiquarian history. The incredibly crucial role of the Black land agents, who were mostly ministers, but also a doctor and activists, helping, really enabling Garrett Smith to realize this plan. All that material is buried in the Garrett Smith collection at Syracuse. It doesn't figure in any county or regional history. All the material about suffrage justice is sequestered there. That had to be dug up. All the information about social interactions between Black farmers and their white neighbors and how congenial they were and how they had each other's back on so many occasions where Black farmers especially needed legal advice and direction from their white neighbors when they felt at such a disadvantage. The pension office was much tougher on Black applicants for pension relief after the war than it was on white, and so it was critical to get affidavits from white neighbors saying he really was hurt. He really is this bad off. He's not lying. I've known him all my life. This widow really is in need. I've grown up with her family. I helped deliver her kids, their friends. They've worked for us. We've worked for them. Trust us. And those affidavits, that testimony, helped secure pension justice for the Black veterans in the Adirondacks. Same thing with testimony from white neighbors and Black neighbors for their white neighbors when land farms were at threat of seizure by the state for back taxes. And you needed your neighbors to step up and say, he really is working on his land. He's improved it. This is what I've seen. I can vouch for this. And Black farmers did this for their white neighbors. White farmers did it for them. Nobody mentions race. These are all buried in the state archives and the tax records. Not easy to get through and find, but a source of information about the quality of the textured, granular quality of social life, and school records and voting records. They did vote, it turns out. They did get the vote. These settlers who moved there and stayed there, and they were voting with great enthusiasm, some of them for their whole lives. And um, legal records are a source of information. So if you don't go to that deeper depth, you don't get the real story. And that's what really brought the news for me and brought the fun. Though I lost my eyesight, honestly, in the process. Looking at a lot of ancient microfilm is really rough on
Right. Oh
the
my
eyes.
goodness. Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Any other questions before we let Amy go for the day? Thoughts, comments as well?
I'm curious if anybody, um, well, no, I won't go there. I'm happy for all responses wherever they come from. And if you're more curious about this remarkable, if failed, effort to settle the Adirondacks with the Black Farm Colony, I hope you'll find my book at a local bookstore, but Amazon is a good place too, and so is Cornell Press. Um, it's a story with a lot of resonance for now because it was an early exemplary instance of affirmative action. That's what he was trying to do, and of environmental distributive justice, and of interracial collaboration. That was foremost on Smith's mind, and in creating an integrated community on a frontier. So all these things are on our boilerplates right now. These aren't unfamiliar concepts. We just don't associate them with the mid 19th century. It's interesting to see where this got started or got a try anyway. Back then, there's some currency there. That's what I
Yeah,
mean.
for
Yeah.
sure. Yes. And just another highlight, Patty says she highly recommends your book. So always great. So yeah. So I think it sounds like I don't have any other questions or comments. Another comment from Colleen for the book. Thanks for the book and the discussion. Much appreciated. Uh,
Great. Well, thank you for listening.
yeah.
I can talk all day, but you don't want that.
Well, and again, I think the wonderful aspect of the book, and then also, that sort of deep dive into the archives and these records, I think is a really it's an undertaking. And I think sort of speaks to what is in there somewhere, and it just takes a lot of work to get it out. And hopefully, we as history folks can help make that easier. Um, for folks in the future to find these stories and to
I'll
bring them
add
to light.
one thing to what I said about the archival work. What it did
Mm,
underscore was the importance of challenging a given narrative and not taking anything for granted. And then asking yourself, as I did, what are the reasons this fake news took hold for so long? The idea that nobody lived, that this was such a catastrophic bust that only one family lasted after the first year. There were many more than that. And the last descendant of a grantee only died a few years ago, who's still living in the Adirondacks. These families had some longevity, even persisting in the region into this century for the first couple of not this century, but the 19th century into the Depression. You see Black names in several of the towns and families long invested in the region. And how come it got erased? What purpose did that serve in the Adirondack narrative? What was being accomplished by scrubbing this history from the record? Well, county histories are being written, huge volumes, as we know, in the age of scientific racialism and eugenics and the idea of purity of race and wanting to claim regions. This would include Vermont to an extent and the Adirondacks for as white country, as a place for white people, and stories that document or celebrate diversity or racial diversity, especially, are not welcome in the official sources. They don't appear, they aren't part of the narrative. So, why was that? How did that happen? Where does that start and when does it end? These are very important questions for historians to grapple with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you again, Amy, and everyone for joining us today. And we will look forward to seeing a Q&A. What? When did it end is a question from Carolyn. So I'm guessing, when did the project itself end, as far as how long was Garrett trying to get folks to move up there, I think
Oh,
maybe is the
Garrett
question.
tries a short time. He gives the land away in 46 and 47. By 1850, he's already getting very discouraged because the pace of settlement is so slow, as it would be considering the grantees had zero money to do this thing. Um, he gives up on it completely and then openly blames the grantees in 1857. And he doesn't do that again. He doesn't like to talk about it. It's a bit of an embarrassment for him, I suspect. And he's got a career in Congress ahead of him. He's going to be busy arming the Free Soil contingents heading to Kansas, and then he's helping out John Brown, and then he goes to work for the Union Army when he's a busy guy, and he puts this experiment in the North Woods of New York behind him. But he turns away the settlers who've moved to these towns who stayed do not. They are a little bitter about being abandoned, but they've made new homes. They aren't going back to the Hudson River Valley. They aren't going back to New York City. They aren't going back to Brooklyn. They are staying put. And those are the stories I explore in the book and their interactions with their neighbors. It's rich stuff. And they don't pass from the scene in any, they're still around into the 1910s and 20s. A few people are around into the 1930s. And the ones who died in the last 2 years are so detached from this history, they didn't identify themselves with it. And the awareness, the knowledge that their family was part of this, had this legacy in his past, came as news. They didn't identify themselves as Black either. Um, but nor did they complain. They were interested in the news and welcomed the local celebration of it. And that was good news too, I think, for
Wow.
everybody hoping to vet this, which the town
Yeah.
did. Yeah,
Wow. Huh.
yeah.
Very intriguing. All right. Ooh, do we have one more question? Everybody's come. All right. And Carol asks, when did the public records change to include this information?
Oh, I think you could say it really changes in Adirondack newspapers in the 1870s when the town historian Mary Mackenzie starts to first ever to do this, to scrupulously document the experience of the Black settlers in her town only, not any of the towns around, but her town, North Elba, Lake Placid. Um, while the grantees were there, what they did, what they farmed, who their neighbors were, how they got along, what's, and she does that. No one's done that before. So that was pioneering research. What she didn't do, and this was a choice she made as a town historian because she felt her mandate was to look down and look at the ground right around her, not to reach out. She didn't explore the political backdrop in terms of the hope for equal voting rights for Black settlers. She didn't explore the dispersion of um, grantee settlers to the townships around her own, which were out of her purview. And that's where I hope I filled in those dots. And those are, every historian builds on the work of the last one. So someone's going to be on my shoulders soon saying, look where we can go with this that you didn't think of.
There you go.
Yeah, but really, it's her work in the 70s, and that isn't anthologized as a book until this century, until 2000 or so, when A Town History comes out. that includes her chapter on the Black grantees. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's the first outing of it. And from there's Russell Banks' book on John Brown, the novelist, Cloud Splitter. He has a lot about Timbuktu, the little settlement near his home that he went to help. Much of it is invented, as is his prerogative as a novelist, but just bringing the colony to light, where so few people realized Brown even lived in the Adirondacks, never mind came there after Black homesteaders had settled there. That brought the news to thousands of readers, and that was exciting.
Wow. Wonderful. Great. Great. Well, we are now just about at time as well. So fantastic. So again, thank you again, Amy, and thank you everyone for coming, and hope everybody stays warm these days and has a good rest of the day. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.